Debunking, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I think he's absolutely right. Evolution is kind of like the grand unifying theory of biology, essentially a scattered number of lineages that developed something you could call a brain, where it's kind of centralized. So that includes, of course, vertebrates. It also includes cephalopods, insects. They have sort of an organized brain. The best model is the Amphioxus, which is an animal that split off from us something like 700 to 750 million years ago or so. So if you compare them to vertebrates, it's a little bit like a hypothalamus attached to a spinal.
Interesting.
So it has this basic, fundamental control system that sort of maintains homeostasis through body physiology, as well as through wiggling that spinal cord every once in a while to move itself to, warmer waters or closer to nutrients. And that's it. And the structures that it does have appear to be homologous. In other words, that those same structures in us still exist from that common plan.
So mind-boggling that can even be the case, possibly, that we still our brain still in some way resembles structures that existed 800 million years ago.
So the hypothalamus is the one thing that you can pretty much point at in almost any animal, including mollusks, jellyfish. And that makes some sense, right? It's kind of a central controller.
What are some of the key evolutionary transitions or leaps, whatever you want to call them, jumps, that you can really point to and say this is, a key point in the development of the human brain over that whole chronological timeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's essentially the big question. So there's this idea, the triune brain idea, very popular. There's a reptilian brain and a neo-mammalian brain, and then a paleomammalian brain and a neo-mammalian brain, as if they're sort of added on top of each other.
Right.
But you can't add things in evolution. You can't just plop a whole new module on. It's not compatible with evolution. So again, the idea of a computer metaphor kind of goes out the window.
Do you think the way that you've been talking about looking back at evolution could inform the way we're making AI models today?
I think the biggest issue there is that they're treating the problem as an input-output map, right?
Right.
Large language models and almost all neural networks are essentially doing input-output maps. That's not what behavior is like. You can describe behavior as a input to output mapping, but then you're missing half of it, right? You're missing the other half, the output to input, which gives meaning to the whole thing.
Paul, welcome to the Giant Shoulder podcast. I'm so excited to have you. I was reading a quote on your website that I think really well sets up the conversation that I want to have and the things that I want to learn from you. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. For that reason, I've started devoting my time to reading about the evolutionary history of the nervous system and writing a book about all the things that I've learned. I'm doing this chronologically. That is, I read about early multicellular animals first, then about early chordates, vertebrates, etc., gradually working my way along the lineage that leads to humans. I believe this has given me a broader perspective on the brain and behavior. I thought this was phenomenal. I think that I like to read about neuroscience, but I haven't quite gotten to the level of going all the way back. So what are your motivations for reading this much from first principles, from going billions of years back and studying the earliest forms of life?
Well, I mean, frankly, I've just always found it interesting. But that first part of that quote is actually from Theodosius Dobzhansky, who said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I think he's absolutely right. There's so many things that just are weird or, convoluted, and we think they're natural, but it's really not. It's really not. And I think it really organizes our understanding. It's kind of like, evolution is kind of like the grand unifying theory of biology. And to me, it's actually kind of strange that everybody isn't doing this. Everybody isn't reading about it all the time and using that. It seems like kind of necessary. And I think, the reason, so there's the personal reason that I just find it so interesting, right?
Which is good enough.
And then there's a sort of a practical reason, and that is that a lot of things in neuroscience don't make sense, exactly as Dobzhansky said. And people are trying to understand them, and I'm one of those people trying to understand them. But a lot of it has to do, a lot of the answers, I think, lie far in the past, and can't be seen, can't be understood until we look at that past. So, for example, there's a lot of studies in psychology that ask, how does the human brain work? There's certain questions and certain answers that come up along the way, but they're just not really working out. I mean,
Right.
I think there's this feeling that, neuroscience is progressing so fast, but we're actually still struggling with some of the same questions we were struggling with 100 years ago. And I think part of the reason is that we're looking at it from the wrong end, right? We're looking at it as if the human brain was, optimally designed to do the kinds of things that we care about.
Right.
And I don't mean that we do, because we do lots of things, but the things that we are most impressed by are the kinds of sort of, cognitive abilities that we really excel at. Things like the conversation that we're having right now. That just seems so impressive to us. We want to understand it, right? But it's not working out. And I think the reason it's not working out is because when you look at the brain, a lot of it is actually organized around the kinds of tasks that have nothing to do with the kinds of things we use them for now, right? And I think everybody knows this, right? Everybody says
Right.
this all the time, right? But I think once you really take that seriously, and you ask yourself, well, are we asking the right questions?
Right.
Then it's obvious that the answer is no. That we have to ask questions in a more sort of biologically fundamental way first, before we can go and ask about, human cognition.
What do you
And so
think is
that's a practical reason that everything that I do in the lab and in my sort of day job is enlightened, I think, by all this work that other people are doing, looking at many different animals and trying to draw comparisons and inferences about what those ancestors were like. And I think by reading their work, I'm understanding everything that I do much more clearly.
Absolutely. That makes complete sense. What do you think is one of the best concrete examples of that, where looking back in our evolutionary past has informed a mechanism that we understand today?
Well, I think one of the biggest things, the most important thing is, to me at least, is that, we think often in psychology that the brain is an information processing system. It's like a computer. It takes inputs and it does a lot of computation, and then it produces outputs. And from that perspective, there's a certain number of questions that you might ask about how it represents information, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at evolution, you realize that's completely incorrect, in fact, because the brain is really a control system. And you realize that everything in biology is actually essentially a feedback control system, a series of nested and complicated interacting feedback control systems. And behavior is not an input-output process because it's a closed loop, right? The output creates new input. And you're not, and natural behavior, it's not like you are in a psychology experiment where you're presented with a stimulus and you produce a response, and you are then rewarded if it's the right response, and then you try again from scratch, right? That's how we've been studying the brain. And when I say we, I mean me, myself as well. But that's not what animals are doing. What animals are actually doing is controlling their state. They're controlling their state to make sure that they're fed, safe, warm, etc. And life and the behavior essentially is a process of transitioning between states by knowing how your output affects your input. So you're essentially continuously controlling the state, your state in the world and internally, through output that you emit through the environment, and you choose the output so that the input, which again informs you about what state you're in, is telling you that things are good. So for example, I'm not being threatened. To not be threatened, the things you do, there are certain things that you do, such as move away from predators. And if I'm hungry internally, Then I go out and seek food to control that state. And, this is, of course, trivial. But what is, I think, not appreciated is how accepting that trivial observation changes completely the even kinds of questions that we ask about how the brain works and what it's actually doing, right? It's not about producing responses or building knowledge inside the head. That's a useful means to an end, but the end is control, right? And so that is, I think, the most important thing that you realize. I mean, you don't need to look at evolution to realize that, but I think when you look at evolution, you realize it's a story of expanding control systems in every case, and humans are no exception. Even the kinds of things that we do, even the kinds of conversations we're having, are essentially embedded within this kind of control system.
Right.
So that's the biggest. I mean, there's specific examples I can give. Like, for example, why do the receptors in the retina point backwards? This is my favorite example because it's so well known that our retina, the receptors are pointing backwards. And there's a lot of attempts to explain this on the basis of like optimality, that maybe it does some filtering, noise filtering, or maybe it protects in some way. But it has nothing to do with that, actually. The answer is very simple, and it has to do with what happened in early chordates, where the nervous system sort of folded inward into a tube. And it essentially drove the receptors that were originally pointing outward, sensibly pointing outward, got folded inward with the creation of the neural tube, something like 800 million years ago. But it didn't matter because the animals at that time were like a millimeter in size and completely transparent. And the only thing they did with those photosensitive cells was like control circadian rhythms, or maybe escape from a shadow or something, right? But once they got folded in like that, there was no going back. And then when the eyes formed, they sort of migrated to the sides of the head with the receptors still pointing inward, created, the retina and the lens and everything. And it was just impossible to flip them over, to flip them back out. So now we have incredibly visually acute animals like hawks and humans and cats that have this ridiculous backwards retina. And it had to do with something that happened long ago. Whereas octopus has the retina facing, the receptors facing the sensible way, right? Because it never went through the stage. It developed an eye through many of the same kinds of, evolutionary adaptations. It's actually quite similar to ours, but it's not backwards. And again, it has to do with the history. And there's lots of examples of this that are maybe a little bit more unfamiliar about things that happened, along the long road that we took.
That's a beautiful one. That's a really, really cool one. Do we have any idea of what the nervous system of the chordate looked like 800 million years ago? Do you think you could say that it had a brain?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of research on this, actually. And one of the most useful, so there's essentially a scattered number of lineages that developed something you could call a brain, where it's kind of centralized. Most animal groups don't have that. But the ones we're familiar with do. And so that includes, of course, vertebrates. It also includes cephalopods and insects. They have sort of an organized brain. But they sort of develop not quite the same way. So in chordates, the best model is the Amphioxus, which is an animal that split off from us something like 700 to 750 million years ago or so. Stayed more or less in its niche. It's kind of a filter feeding, relatively, humble filter feeding creature that just hides a lot. And it survived for all this time without too many changes. And it has a lot of the structures that you will find in vertebrates. And I'm mostly drawing on the work of Thurston Lacali and Linda and Peter Holland and others who have studied these animals these animals have actually been recognized as being a key animal for decades, maybe 100 years even. People have known that these are crucial animals to look at that particular transition. Anyway, so if you compare them to vertebrates, Lacali at least describes it. It's a little bit like a hypothalamus attached to a spinal.
Interesting.
So it has this basic, fundamental control system that sort of maintains homeostasis through body physiology, as well as through wiggling that spinal cord every once in a while to move itself to, warmer waters or closer to nutrients, because it's a filter feeder. And that's it. And the structures that it does have appear to be homologous. In other words, that those same structures in us still exist from that common plan back then. And it also has a bit of a visual system, but it doesn't have paradise. It just has a kind of a single eye patch with just a handful of neurons. And it uses that for escape. And that might be part of the vertebrate tactile escape circuit that we all have. You and I have, all vertebrates have. And that might be, it's unclear, but it's good evidence that that's there in Amphioxus. So given that we know approximately when we diverged from them by comparing the genetics, we can conclude that back then those structures were there. Maybe there were other structures that were lost. Maybe it's possible there's some convergence, of course, but in this case, most of these things have been relatively well established that it's actually homologous in terms of like cell type C.
So mind-boggling, like that can even be the case, possibly, that we still our brain still in some way resembles structures that existed 800 million years ago. That's a number that the brain can't comprehend or really understand.
Well, yeah, exactly. When you think about the great variety of animals, so the hypothalamus is the one thing that you can pretty much point at in almost any animal, including mollusks and like jellyfish. Even there's structures that have been sort of proposed to be homologous to that, and that makes some sense, right? It's kind of a central controller.
Right.
The hypothalamus is responsible for things like basic bodily temperature, nutrient control, and so a really fundamental physiology without which you can't live. And that got established relatively early, essentially in all animals with neurons. And yeah, you can point at that. I mean, there's a cool offshoot here, which is controversial, but super cool, and that is that comb jellies. I don't know if you're familiar with these creatures. They're
not intimately.
Amazing looking. They look like aliens.
Okay,
and in
I'll
fact,
have to put one on the screen.
Oh yeah. You may want to get a photo on your podcast. So they're incredibly cool looking, and they're really strange. And it's been suggested recently with some pretty good evidence that they actually evolved nervous systems independently from the rest of the animal kingdom. So they are really are kind of like aliens.
Like jellyfish in some way? Is that the same thing that
they
happened
look
with
like jellyfish, but we're much closer to jellyfish than we are to them.
Wow.
So they had originally been grouped among jellyfish because they kind of look like jellyfish, although they're really strange. I mean, they move with this kind of like light pattern. They really look like alien spaceships.
So cool.
And so it was assumed that they were part of the same group of animals as jellyfish. But then more recent evidence suggests they're actually much earlier offshoot from a time when there were no neurons. So we split off from them at a time from a common ancestor that did not have neurons. And so we came up with neurons, or our branch and their branch independent. And that's really cool. I don't know if it's true, and if there's a debate, but it's rather cool. But anyway, in our branch, as soon as you get neurons, you can say there's something like a hypothalamus. I mean, in terms of the function and the cell types and things like that. And that gets conserved. And, you think about the escape circuit of the Amphioxus. Once you have an escape circuit and you're living in a world full of predators, there is never a generation that can go without having, right? I mean, you can have animals. I mean, you do actually. I mean, there are some animals that essentially hide in the sand forever, right? And they don't do anything. So they don't escape. They just hide. But for any mobile animals, you really you can't abandon that circuit or you won't you won't survive.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff like that. And, and in fact, if you go just a little bit further to about 550 million years ago, where we branched off from animals like lamprey, then you have almost the entire vertebrate nervous system laid down. It's actually amazing
It's
how much.
mind-boggling.
Yeah, it really is. It's
Worth
mind-boggling.
restating, 550 million years ago when we departed, you basically have the full vertebrate nervous system laid down.
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of the topology of the connections and such. The one thing we didn't have back then, it looks as like the cerebellum, which was really important. That was about another 100, maybe another 50 million years later. But everything else, there's debates of this. Everything else, at least topologically, can be found. And then, of course, it's a matter of, certain things grew dramatically in some lineages and not others, right? So in our lineage, when we became nocturnal as mammals, we expanded part of our forebrain into the cerebral cortex. And that's something that really grew dramatically in us that doesn't grow in other animals to the same extent. But again, topologically, the layout, sort of the connection structure, is very simple, which is
so cool.
It's quite dramatic.
And that is distinctly for that reason is why we can search so far back and still derive insights. You mentioned about the comb jelly. Is that what it was called? Yeah. There's evidence that it evolved distinctly from all vertebrates and our nervous system. What would that evidence look like? I presume it's genetic, but does that just mean that the genetics is completely distinct? Like what does evidence look like when something evolves in a completely separate lineage to
well,
us?
it has to do with comparisons across a few different branches. So sponges have no vestige, no evidence of ever having had neurons. So there's a fairly well established that sponges never evolved neurons, right? And then when you compare sponges and chordates, so bilaterians, which is us, right? Includes us and insects and gigantic numbers of animals, right? So bilaterians and sponges are more closely related than both of them are to comb jellies. Essentially, it means that comb jellies split off earlier than sponges. And at the time we split up from sponges, there were no neurons. And so from that, you can conclude that we developed neurons after we split off from sponges. And if the comb jellies split off earlier, well, then that goes for them as well. We don't know exactly when they evolved neurons, but it was far later. So I think it's essentially the comparison between those three groups that leads to that conclusion.
Very cool. Why is the jellyfish so unique? You brought up the jellyfish evolution. I've always thought this is so crazy that there's just an animal that's still, so common in the world today. I'm lucky enough to be a scuba diver and seen many in the wild, and they're just absolutely stunning creatures. They're amazing to look at, incredibly intelligent. But how do you get this secondary evolution of intelligence? Or I presume it's probably
wait, you're talking about the comb jellies?
I'm talking about the jellyfish here.
Oh, jellyfish regular. Okay, well, jellyfish
and
are
octopus. Sorry, octopus. I mean as well.
Oh, octopus. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Octopus. Yes. Sorry, I misspoke there. Octopus. I mean, yes.
Yeah. So octopi are on a different branch from us. They're on the same branch as insects, and it's split off very, very long time ago from a common ancestor that was nothing like an octopus or an insect or us or anything like a fish even, right? It was kind of like a flatworm, right?
Okay.
And then they went their separate way. We went our way. They went their way, and they they dealt with a complex world, and we dealt with a complex world, and we came up with various solutions to dealing with. Well, I wouldn't say solutions, right? Because that's not how evolution works. But we sort of stumbled onto mechanisms that allowed us to survive just as they did. And some of those mechanisms are the same. There's certain principles that are useful. So by then we were bilaterally organized, and they maintained it and we maintained that organization. So there's certain structures that could be compared, like again the hypothalamus and certain subdivisions within it. But the spinal cord is something that we came up with. Eyes, we had photosynthetic organs long ago, but eyes developed independently in that lineage with respect to ours. So, and then since then it's been independent. It's like they came up with all kinds of amazing mechanisms, and so have we. All right.
Right. Do we
We
understand how?
don't read much about octopi, right? Because they are not helpful for my project, right? Because
Right. Okay. Makes
on their
sense.
own, it's like it doesn't help me. I get a lot more of learning about flatworms or the Amphioxus, because it's what I focus on is animals that split off and then didn't change so much, right?
Right.
So the Amphioxus is good, lamprey are good, birds are not so good because birds did a lot of innovation independently. Birds are super cool and really impressive, but they don't help so much to understand mammals. And
Makes
octopi,
sense.
again, like, almost like an alien species.
Yeah. What are the factors that go into the amount of iterations evolution puts an organism through? Like, why do some things stay fairly the same over hundreds of million years, and some things and like other things completely change? What are the variables that go into that? The changing environments.
I think it has to do with sort of traveling to different niches, right?
Right.
You can be happy in a niche, but
Can
you
you
can
explain
get
what you mean by a niche? Sorry, because I know that's a bit of an
kind of a
evolutionary term.
like a lifestyle and an environment around you. So, for example, sharks hit upon the eat everything niche, and they
Good
stuck with it
strategy.
because once you're on top of the food chain, you kind of want to stay there.
Yeah.
And but other animals were pushed out, or and found new sort of ways to survive. So for example, in our case, um, there was a point where surviving in the ocean was just really difficult. But if you get into the shallows, things were a little bit safer there for a time. Not the case anymore, but for a time things were a little safer, and so certain animals did well by adapting to this kind of shallow water existence and eventually getting out on land. Back then, land had plenty of insects and plants, so lots of stuff to eat, but no real threats to large animals, at least. So it's things like that. But I'm not an evolutionary biologist, right? So questions about the mechanisms of evolution are not really for me to answer. I read the people who are the true experts, and my goal is to try to understand what that tells us about the brain, right? So knowing, for example, that animals, at certain point, our ancestors, a certain branch got out on land, has certain implications about how their lifestyle, how their niche changed, and how certain adaptations happen. Like vision becomes incredibly useful once you get out of the water, because suddenly it has this enormous range, and you can do all kinds of complicated stuff that were not possible before. You can navigate by landmarks that are like 100 kilometers away or something, right?
Right.
So, and there's nothing like that in the water. So vision becomes really important. There's lots of things that happen there, that certain circuits just exploded in complexity, that were using vision. So, there's all these kinds of, so again, my chronological journey has been kind of looking at those stages. What happened when we became actually effective predators back, still in the seas, and then our ancestors, sort of got out of there and went out on land, and then dominated the land for a while, but we lost the battle for sort of the diurnal world on land because dinosaurs were around, right? And so our ancestors became small and nocturnal, and survived in that world. And we went again through a number of changes. We lost color vision. We relied much more on certain other senses like olfaction and somatosensation. So lots of changes happen again, and it has to be a chronological story, right? Because every stage sets up what the next stage can be, right? What circuits do you have available to you that you can modify now to this new lifestyle? And
Right.
that's the story throughout. So what I'm doing essentially is I'm reading what people say happened, and
Yeah.
what structures are there anatomically. And I'm trying to, spin a plausible hypothesis about how the functions went hand in hand with those structures. Why is it that certain enlargements went in hand with certain behavior enlargements, and what could that mean in a kind of a theoretical and a computational sense, and what those animals actually did with those things? All the way, always sort of seeking connection to modern primates and humans.
Right. Such a fascinating line of inquisition. If you look at the whole chronology of, say, 800 million years ago, where you have something that resembles a hypothalamus, to today, what are some of the key evolutionary transitions or leaps, whatever you want to call them, jumps, that point out that you can really point to and say this is, a key point in the development of the human brain over that whole chronological timeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's essentially the big question. And yeah, so there's a number of them. The having spatial vision was a really big deal in early vertebrates. Developing an eye that could actually sort of differentially use information from different parts of space. That was a really big deal for both predation and escape. And the ability to, which came around the same time, to learn through reinforcement learning. Again, early vertebrates. That was huge. That was a really big deal, and it was the right time. It was just in time, because that's when the predation really took off in the seas, and there were large arthropods and mollusks already that were very good at being predators, and jellyfish. In fact, the normal type of jellyfish, not comb jellies, they were major predators in the seas. And so our ancestors, the branch that survived are the ones that developed these certain abilities to guide themselves using vision. And I think that was a really big one. I mean, there's other senses, of course, that are very important for fish, like electrosense and such, and pressure senses. But vision was a big deal.
Do we know how old that is, when the first visual system evolved?
Well, the first visual,
Depends what you call vision, I guess.
sensitive. The spatial vision, I would say, by the time we split off from lamprey. Lamprey have eyes that are very much like ours. They have retinotopic projections into their midbrain and into the forebrain. Again, the topology is already there, a lot of it, And again, now this is the work of Sten Grillner and his group, and various people who have come through his group. They've really characterized the lamprey in great detail. And it has really a lot of the machinery. So that was there at least at that point, and it's estimated about 550 million years ago we split off from. So that was a big deal. Cerebellum was a big deal, like maybe 50 million years later, which one idea about the cerebellum that I like, and it's quite popular, is that it predicts consequences of action. And that makes it possible to control yourself really well and do things like move a large, heavy body through water at high speed. That's without swamping your sensory input with the pressure waves that you create by moving. So and that really helped. And so then you get large sharks and giant fish of all different types, and so that was a really big deal, and it remains a big deal, and it was retained. Then there was.
We know structurally, sorry, just because all of these are so interesting. Do we know, or is there any guesses on why the cerebellum sort of evolved almost as a secondary structure? It sits at the back of the brain underneath. It's sometimes called the small brain. Do we have any guesses on why it evolved morphologically in that way?
Well, I mean, morphologically, everything is sort of...
Or is that relevant even?
Everything is... So it was part of the hindbrain. So at that point, we had a forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, and spinal. So the subdivisions were there. And by the way, the hypothalamus gave rise to the forebrain, right? So when I said that it was first the hypothalamus plus spinal cord, it's kind of like the hypothalamus developed the forebrain, as a sort of a substructure in it,
Interesting. Okay.
which became, of course, very large, right? The midbrain was sort of in the boundary between the spinal cord and the hypothalamus, and then a hindbrain evolved within that sort of second segment. There's long, unpronounceable, barely unpronounceable names for these
Right.
things that I'm not going to bother with. But the point is that
Yeah.
these things sort of segregate over time, and the part that the cerebellum emerged out of was already sort of a separate segment, the hindbrain, that got elaborated. Part of it got elaborated, sort of a kind of like a sensory relay got elaborated. And there are other cerebellum-like structures in there. It's just that this one of them became particularly large in jawed vertebrates, and became so useful that it grew into this thing. So the reason why it looks separate from the forebrain is because long ago they were already in separate segments. The forebrain grew out of this front part, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum out of this hindbrain part. And when everything gets sort of squeezed together, they'll look separate. But they're actually very, very tightly interconnected, right? The connections were laid down already between these structures back then, and they're still there. So they're very, very closely interconnected. They're just far apart physically, right? But in terms of synapses, they're fairly tightly integrated. Anyway, so and as to why the structure, grew is in part because it was so useful, and it's actually more than half the neurons of our brain are in there.
That's what I was going to ask next. Is it has a disproportionate amount of neurons for the volume that it also takes up? Is there any reason why?
Probably because it has this. So most of those cells are granule cells. In fact, I think so. More than half of the cells in the human brain are granule cells of the cerebellum, and I think it's partially because it uses this. Okay, so here's a theory. Okay, again, it's a relatively popular one, that the cerebellum does a kind of massive parallel coincidence detection, which allows it to sort of discover, essentially through brute force, a very large number of units, discover relationships between what you do and what output you produce and what input it results in. So if you move your arm, how does what kind of forces or what kind of proprioceptive signals you'll get back and things like that. Anyway, the point is, and it can do it in general sense. It can do it for very abstract things as well. And so the point is that it uses the strategy of large numbers to have all these combinatorial possibilities. And so it grows disproportionately for that reason, right? And like in an elephant, it's like 90% or 95% of the neurons are granule cells in the cerebellum. I mean, it's like it just becomes numerically a thing. But of course, the big thing is where always the value of a structure is best understood in terms of the energy it uses, right? Because in the end, that's the currency of life, right? If you're not worth your energy, you're gonna get lost eventually,
right?
So anyway, so I believe that's a good answer for that.
Awesome.
Again, I'm not really.
I love digging into these. This is so interesting to me. Okay, so the next system you mentioned was reinforcement. That's sort of basal ganglia structures.
Yeah. Yep.
We're 500 million years ago. Where does the basal ganglia pop up?
Well, it's also part of the forebrain, also part of the hypothalamus. So the part of the hypothalamus. So this is based on the work of Luis Puelles, who looks at development across different animals. He and his group and other people that do similar work. And he's sort of shown that there's certain subdivisions within the neural tube, of which the very front one he calls the terminal hypothalamus. And that's mostly the kinds of internal physiology that we often think of the hypothalamus doing, like maintaining body temperature and sleep-wake cycles, things like that. the second segment he calls the peduncular hypothalamus. Well, actually, he calls it the secondary prosencephalon, but let's not get it. Anyway, the point is that thing bulges out on one end into the forebrain. So that second segment of the hypothalamus grows this gigantic thing out of it, which we call the forebrain. And that thing, I think, Puelles doesn't engage in speculation like this, but I'm willing to. And I would say that thing also is controlling the state of the animal, but that thing is responsible for controlling the state of the animal through the world, right? And that's why I think it becomes so enormous, because the challenge of controlling the animal state by changing hormonal secretions and such is complicated, but it's nothing like the complication of actually going out, finding food, and controlling your state through actual behavior with a complex world. So that part has just kept growing and growing and getting more and more complicated. And already in lamprey, you see it subdivided into two sections. One called the subpallium, which is like the basal ganglia, and one is like the pallium, which is like the cerebral cortex, but many other structures as well. And so the whole thing subdivides very differently than what we're familiar with in sort of a neuroscience textbook. But it's the kind of, so anyway, I mean, he's got a model of brain development that I think will be the textbook model in, 10 or 20 years after enough people come around. But it's rather powerful. Anyway, and so the basal ganglia were essentially a segment of that forebrain long ago, where it, and if we're right about it being involved in reinforcement learning, then it was doing that probably way back then, because you can show those kinds of mechanisms that we can study them in mice and we can study them in lamprey. In fact, there's a number of people who came out of Grailner's lab where they studied lamprey and set up their own labs where they're now studying mice. And many of them are finding, remarkably similar things. So again, I think we can infer that reinforcement learning evolved back then. And there are many people have suggested that was a big deal. That was a really major transition. And obviously, right, it should be. You can see how that would be so powerful.
And do we know what the organism actually was where these brain developments would have been happening within? Some sort of fish, some sort of lamprey-like
something
organism?
Like a fish, yeah. So okay. there's a fossil creature called the conodont, which lived for almost made it to this day. They died out, I don't know, like 50 million or maybe more. But anyway, they were probably a good model of an early vertebrate. Lamprey are not bad, actually. They're considered, again, I'm just saying what I read, but they're considered a pretty good model. Except their lifestyle is, more parasitic than predatory. I mean, it's kind of predation, but not like, so conodonts were probably a good version. They were kind of like lamprey. They had the same kind of body shape, the same kind of lifestyle, except more eating than sucking the blood out. Yeah, I mean, essentially, think of frankly, sharks, right? Sharks have diverged a little bit. I mean, maybe a lot, probably, from that last common ancestor, but they remained predators. At that point, I think our ancestors were more predators, especially after they got the cerebellum and a couple of, I guess it was not for another 100 million years or so until the bodies became big. It was only later, actually, that the bodies became big. And that's when we sort of turned the tables on all those jellyfish and arthropods and started eating them instead. And they never were able to get big, right? Not arthropods anyway. So that's, so that was a major thing back in the waters.
Okay, so we're about 500 million years ago. We're a vision-seeing fish that can reinforce their learning about the environment.
Yep. And then guide themselves also. Something like a hippocampus is already around there, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. What was the next critical leap in evolutionary development?
I think the next really major one. I mean, there's a number of structures that appear along the way, subdivisions in particular of the forebrain, but and enlargements of the midbrain to become more effective. But I think a really major transition was coming out on land,
Right.
obviously, right? And that was a fairly long process, and it wasn't just about breathing. It was very much about like body structure. You had to be able to not rely on water, and moving on land is tricky for a fish, essentially, right? And vision, of course, and the complexity of the world. And so then I kind of think of like a salamander. Think of a salamander, which is a
Interesting.
relatively simple creature. Actually, its brain is not much more than a fish. Sorry to salamanders, but in fact, maybe salamanders even regressed a little bit from the last common ancestor, from those first tetrapods that got out on land. So there are a number of innovations there that happened, and that was a really major transition. And now things really change. I mean, the world is really different when you're out of the water. It's not really three-dimensional in the same sense.
Right.
Things that used to just be, surfaces, objects become obstacles, right? You can't swim above them, right? There's control of temperature becomes really tricky. You could overheat or dry out, and so there's lots of problems a lot of challenges of
Right.
surviving out.
It's
Um,
sort of miraculous we even made that. We ever made that leap, because
yeah, well, the thing
there.
is, some of us did and some of us didn't, right? So the point is that evolution is always expanding diversity, right? That's all it's really doing, right? It's just
Right.
expanding diversity. It's not going anywhere. It's
Yeah.
just spreading out, and some of those edges happen to latch onto something that works. And so the fish that got sort of squeezed out of the deep water because there was too many predators eating it. There were a few that sort of made it out on that edge, and lots of them died off, right? Lots
Yeah.
of them didn't make it, but some of them did. Some of them stumbled onto the kinds of modifications that made it possible to survive, and eventually, were able to move onto land permanently. So this is the amniotes now, which is like birds and reptiles and mammals. But you think think of a sort of a simple lizard.
Right.
It can actually live and survive out on land for a long time. And around that time, there were a lot of innovations having to do with the nervous system, a lot of segregation of circuitry, starting to look more and more like what we're familiar with. There were, with amphibians, things are kind of undifferentiated. You don't have, you don't have a lot of sort of unimodal sensory systems. You have a lot of things that are just mixed in all kinds of ways. And in reptiles and amniotes, essentially, you start getting more of the same kind of specializations in the forebrain in particular. The
What would the
midbrain, as far
land
as
have
I know,
even?
had not changed that much at that point still.
Right. What would the land have even looked like at that point? So the organism needs to escape from the water and then immediately have some sort of food resource on land ready for it there, adapted from whatever it was eating in the past in the water. Do we
Well, I
know
mean,
what?
it was a very long transition, so it was a matter of gradually, sort of expanding your diet and then relying more on what the newer stuff that you find on land. So, well, there were insects, so that's a really good source of food. All
Right.
kinds of invertebrates, right, and plants. But I don't know. I think actually, I'm not sure what the consensus is, but I think our ancestors were probably more relying on insects and like millipedes and all kinds of related arthropod-like creatures that
Right.
were
True.
already um,
Right.
and then the biggest problem was having to give up water. Actually, that was a big thing because certain senses, like we had electrosense and pressure sense, that just didn't work in air. Locomotion, swimming through water works because water provides resistance, and when you undulate, you kind of push yourself off of it, and that doesn't work in air. In
Right.
air, you have to you have to simulate the water by having pegs that we now call legs that you can essentially pivot around, right? And so that's why a salamander sort of does this kind of swimming on land movement, because it's kind of putting down its legs and moving. So anyway, there's all kinds of challenges that had to be met, and also, I mean, just like even not drying out is a big deal. You know, an amphibian is essentially always in danger. If it can't get back to water, it's going to dry out and die.
Right.
But anyway, amniotes developed more different skin and again and adapted more and more to the lifestyle on land. And I think the big thing that happens on land is that, again, the kinds of behaviors that you engage in are, you know, more complicated. And, you know, thirst becomes an issue, right? Thirst is not an issue if you're a fish.
Right.
You don't have to go forage for water. But on land, you do. You have to actually now worry about, you have to now control your sort of fluid balance through behavior, through the world now.
Yeah.
So there's this concept of affordances, which I think is really useful, which I've always found very inspiring. And the idea, affordances is essentially what the opportunities for action that the environment presents you with. You know, if you're a mouse, then a small hole affords shelter. If you're a cat, that same small hole maybe affords a source of food, right? So the point is that the affordances on the terrestrial world are quite different than in an aquatic world, and the animals had to discover how to exploit those things, again, through adaptations. You know, so things like you know, up and down becomes really dramatically constraining. Things like cliffs, you know, things like a flat surface to rest upon as opposed to a slanted surface. So all these kinds of innovations, all these kinds of opportunities and demands forced a lot of adaptation, you know.
Right.
Or, you know, I should say rewarded certain adaptations more than others.
Yeah.
Right. Again, it's not, it doesn't have a purpose, not going anywhere. It's just stumbling onto solutions.
I remember reading a book about this a while ago. I can't remember its title, but it was basically about the first fish that was found with wrists. So, like, I presume between fish and salamander, you kind of have all of these fish reptile intermediates, which are sort of just fish with kind of very premature limbs, like kind of wrists,
so you have
kind of
lobed fin
elbows.
fish. Yeah, so you have ray fin fish, which are the familiar ones, and then there's lobed fin fish, which have these kinds of fleshy, thick kind of fins, and they're the ones that made it out on land. So they are our cousins, and our ancestors were kind of like them. And the basic idea is that because they had those kinds of fins, they were able to locomote on land.
Right.
And so that's why I think that finding things like those bones and something like a wrist would be a big deal, because it would be one of those transitions. That's one of the necessary things.
Right. I know your answer to this is going to be that we don't know, but I'm curious to get your answer anyway. Are these conscious? Where does consciousness emerge in this chronological lineage?
Well, I think consciousness is one of those terms that we use that doesn't fit anything in the actual world, you know?
Interesting.
So, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems in trying to understand the brain, right? We have all kinds of language that we use to describe behavior, and we sort of use it under the assumption that actually corresponds to something real, you know? But usually it doesn't, right? I mean, because the language itself is like, you know, hundreds of years old. I mean, it's something that, you know, people came up with, you know, before they were even doing any kind of scientific study of. So there's these terms that then we go and we try to seek explanations for that are, you know, sometimes best abandoned, frankly, and replaced with other terms. Consciousness is one of those. And I think people are quite well aware that when we say the word consciousness, we often mean very different things. There's sort of phenomenal consciousness, which is kind of like the feeling of being alive or perceiving something, right? But then there's like access consciousness, which is like being able to recollect your memories. Those things are not necessarily the same. And so when you ask about like consciousness, I'm not sure that's a good question to ask regarding evolution, because it carries too much excess baggage, right? It's like saying, was it intelligence, right? Well, define it.
Yeah.
There's no good definition that will fit. So I mean, I think certain things like the distinction between self and other,
Right. That's the distinction
probably
I was going
extremely
to.
old.
That's what I was going to bring up as a specific definition of consciousness. Then maybe when organisms started being able to model themselves.
Yeah. So modeling, I don't know, but distinguishing yourself from the outside world probably had to be pretty early when we were mobile. That was probably a useful distinction, but again, there's no awareness necessarily of that distinction. It's not, it's not consciousness in the phenomenal sense.
Yeah.
So that would be one, but that doesn't necessarily entail representation, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a model of yourself. That might be much, much later. In fact, relatively recent, like 200 million years, which is relatively recent.
Yeah.
So, I think the problem. So here's a kind of like another reason why I'm doing this, why I'm reading about evolution, is we have a bunch of terms, right, and a bunch of questions that we ask in neuroscience, like how does the brain make decisions, right? This is something that sort of I do. That's my day job, right?
Right.
Or how does attention work? Or what is the mechanism of consciousness, right? And the problem, I think, is that we framed the questions prematurely before we really knew enough to know whether we framed them correctly, right? So, like for example, the question of how does the brain make decision, it inevitably leads to questions like, are the basal ganglia involved in decision making, or is the cerebellum involved in decision making, right? And I think the problem with it is that there's many, many different kinds of things that one might call decision making,
Right.
and they are not the same thing, and they are not the same mechanisms. And some of them are very similar to other things that we call with different names. And
Right.
so the example I'll give,
It's a language problem.
decision making, right? There's the decision of whether I want to go to sleep, whether I'm tired or whether I'm not tired, and I want to be active versus rest. That has nothing to do with the basal ganglia, probably. I mean, that's hypothalamic, right? That's a system that's controlling sleep-wake cycles, and there's a certain mechanisms that can be studied, and it deserves kind of a separate kind of category, right? Then there's decisions I make, like what kind of career to pursue. That's totally different.
Right.
And then there's the decisions I make as to when I'm walking through a crowd and somebody's coming at me, do I pass them on the right or the left? That's really different, right? Anyway, so there's certain kinds of decisions, and they're really different, and they shouldn't be sort of lumped together. And it's hard to know what the subdivisions are, right? It's hard to know what is the border between one thing and another thing. Where is that system different?
Right.
And evolution tells that's the most valuable thing about looking at evolution, right? Because evolution is actually a process of progressive specialization of systems, right? So you had a sort of an undifferentiated neural net that differentiated into something like a hypothalamus versus spinal cord. And the hypothalamus developed these different subdivisions. The spinal cord developed subdivisions, and so on and so on and so on. And those are the pieces, right? those neuroanatomical pieces, which I think have a functional correlate to them because they did things for our ancestors, that tells us how to subdivide the big question of, how does the brain control behavior? How to subdivide into the appropriate questions that actually have an answer that actually exists in biology. And another example I would give here is attention, which, there's the famous quote from William James that everyone knows what attention is. But do we actually, right? Do we actually know what attention is? Because there's many, again, like decision making, there's many different kinds of attentions attentional systems you can imagine. There's the attention that you have in terms of attending to different places in space. And then there's attention where you sort of attend to certain aspects of your past experience, like you can attend to a memory in terms of what somebody was saying or what they were wearing or what day it was, right? And so those are almost certainly not the same. And the interesting thing about spatial attention is that if you look at where you find it in, let's say, the primate brain, largely in parietal regions, and what kind of models people make of that system, and then you look at what other people might be doing in terms of action selection, like how we select one action versus another, what regions are involved, what are the models, and then you look at those two literatures, you realize they're the same. Right? It's also parietal cortex. The models are the same kinds of sort of biased competition models that are sometimes mathematically the same. And so those two things are actually close, those two things are actually related,
Right.
It has to do with action guidance and with sensory information. So choosing sensory information to guide actions is in no sense choosing action. Anyway, the point is that these things that one might classify as distinct are actually the same.
Gotcha.
Whereas other things that we think are the same are actually distinct. And it's just a whole it's essentially a big mess to try to say, we're going to take the terms devised by philosophers in, ancient Greece, and then we're going to try to find those in nature and in biology. That's a very precarious, assumption, right? And so the question of how to subdivide the brain is a real problem, and people have been struggling with this,
right?
And there's whole research efforts. Like Russ Poldrack has sort of spearheaded a research effort to sort of try to formalize what really are the pieces of cognition, but I think the whatever the pieces are, they come from evolution, right? We know actually where they came from, right? And the question is, what were the stages of specialization that occurred, as we became predators and as we got out on land, as we became nocturnal, and then as we moved into trees and became diurnal again. I mean, those transitions and those adaptations that happened, I think, will tell us what the right pieces are.
Right.
And so this is why I'm saying, other than just the coolness of reading this interesting material, it has a real practical repercussion for my own work, because I'm asking different questions than I would have been asking. And I think they're probably better questions because they're immediately grounded in biology, right? It's not philosophy, and then you search for the essence of, let's say the essence of memory, right? Which again is one of those things which is not a single thing, obviously.
Yeah.
But you try to imagine what is the essence of memory, and I'm going to make a task that touches upon that essence, as if, Aristotle had it exactly right back then. I mean, he was brilliant, but he didn't have the knowledge that we have now, and we know more, right?
Right.
We can phrase better questions, and I think again, I think we're rather lost with what the questions are, and yet I think it's sitting right there. The answers are sitting right there, waiting for us in looking at evolution. It's just we have to go through that process, I think.
Yeah, it's a dilemma, because the brain loves niche categorization, discrete categories of information, right? Bucket A, bucket B, bucket C. But then the brain itself is not a thing that you can really put into bucket A, bucket A, bucket B, bucket C. So the
Yeah,
way
exactly. And there's probably a good evolutionary story for why the brain likes those buckets, right?
right. I mean, it makes sense from an energy conservation point of view, right? To be roughly correct is more useful than being incredibly accurate from an energy expenditure point of view. I
Well, I
think.
mean, it has to do with, in the end, you have to do stuff, right? And you're going to approach the thing or you're not going to approach the thing. In the
Yeah,
end, it's a categorical decision.
yeah,
If the fruit is different colors, there can be all different colors of fruit, but determining whether it's ripe or not, or edible or not, that is going to determine whether you're going to approach it or not. And so somewhere down the line, it becomes categorical, right? Whether
yeah,
it's at the perceptual end or only at the output end, it's going to have to be categorical. And so I think that's really the fundamental reason why we naturally have categories, and
right,
that's even more so in terms of more abstract actions that we, when we interact with each other, we are um, we are sort of making use of the categories in the other, essentially, and so it just strengthens the usefulness of having.
right.
So I mean, I think again, but like you say, though, the brain loves this for
Yeah,
good reasons, and it tries to see categories where there really isn't, or there's a pragmatic. Where does the valley become the mountain?
yeah,
It's probably, it depends on what crops you want to grow, right? That's when you're going to make that definition, or where the trees are, one way or another. So I think it's we draw categories for functional reasons, but we shouldn't assume that they exist. But there are subdivisions, right? There are specializations in the brain, right? The question is, what are they? And they're probably not ones that were defined before we knew very much about neuroscience. It would be very unlikely that philosophical studies of the mind, as a disembodied kind of, non-physical thing, would have stumbled onto the exact right pieces to actually understand the biological organ that is the brain.
right.
Given that remote, the unlikelihood of those pieces being right, we have to be willing to abandon them, especially when the evidence is overwhelming in some of these cases that they're just not useful terms.
Yeah, it's a
We
huge
wrote a
problem.
paper with some colleagues. Sorry, I just want to get back
No,
to the
go ahead.
attention. We wrote some paper with some colleagues. Um, Heather Niedli suggested we call it "No One Knows What Attention Is," which I thought was clever, because I think that's exactly right. I mean, we don't know. We don't know what attention is. We have a term that we use to discuss certain phenomena, but those phenomena are in some cases relatively well understood, in some cases not. Some cases they involve one part of the brain, some cases in the other. And I think we should treat them as the separate things that they are.
I think it's difficult, though. It brings up a lot of problems with communication. Like, my primary job is a neuroscience communicator. So I'm trying to take really complex, nuanced ideas and communicate them to people. And if people don't have this massive stored knowledge of how the brain works, like most people don't, chunking and categorization is really the only way that they can actually embed any information, right? The limbic system is where emotions come from. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. They latch onto these single definitions because they make narrative sense. They can say, this region does this thing, but I don't know how to communicate nuance and all of that elaborate mechanism and evolutionary, ideas, which are beautiful and incredible and much more accurate, to general lay people in a way that they'll remember. And especially now with social media and the way that media is communicated is short, fast, A means B, this protocol does this does this. I constantly run into this issue of trying to communicate complicated mechanistic nuance in a fast world where people latch onto simple solutions.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And I think, as you say, it's a challenge for all of us, but particularly for you, because you're trying to reach a very broad audience.
Right.
And you can't assume any particular kind of knowledge. Like I could throw a couple of words around in here, and I know you're going to understand what basal ganglia is, but let's face it, I didn't know what that was, before I got into neuroscience. And
Exactly.
so, and so everybody has to sort of, if you want to have the conversation, you have to have agreed upon words to
Yes.
carry on the conversation, right? But the problem is that in science, you cannot rely on the words that you inherited from your, predecessors. Your job actually is to find ways in which they were wrong, right? And to recognize that everything that I come up with, people who come after me will eventually find things that are wrong and refine that their viewpoints and reject some of the things some of the categories that I might like, right? And so that's the thing, right? As scientists, we really have to be willing to abandon familiar ideas.
Right.
But you don't want to do that all the time, because then you won't have anything, right?
Yeah.
And so, I'm pretty comfortable with the idea that there is this thing called evolution. I'm not gonna, I'm gonna assume that one.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of other things I'm not, I have to be a little bit careful about. I'm assuming, for example, that Grillner got the lamprey right, and that Puelas has brain development right, and Leah Krubitzer's got the mammals all worked out. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But, they would probably, each of them would probably caution me against that, because it's always a work in progress, right? But the
Yeah.
problem is, yes, as you say, the problem is that people want to know what is known in a language that is accessible to them.
Yeah.
And whether you're a layperson or a scientist, or a neuroscientist, even an expert, there's always things you're not aware of. Like I did not know, for example, the real subdivisions of the neural tube that have been relatively well established now by these developmental studies. I didn't know those things even like 5 years ago or 6 years ago when I started getting interested in this stuff. Well, I was longer than that. The point is, you have to be willing, I think, to give up on those things and to change your definitions as you're learning things. But again, that's the challenge for you, because if somebody asks you, summarize brain evolution or answer this question in 3 sentences or something, you're not going to be able to go through all that with them. You're going to have to put it into terms that they know. But again, so and that's a challenge. But I think that you're kind of stuck with it. You maybe the thing to do is to sort of, like for example, if you want to summarize the kind of things that I'm saying, start with feedback control actually, because a lot of stuff sort of follows. Certain ideas just topple out of the picture once you start talking about feedback control, and you snap out of certain ideas that people are really that are really very strongly entrenched. Like this idea of the brain as a computer.
Yeah.
It's so deeply entrenched that some people find it surprising that anybody would even question that, right?
Yeah.
Even though we all agree that everything is open to questioning. But that one, people find it really hard. What on earth are you talking about? Of course it's a computer. But, that immediately makes you think of, well, it's building models inside the head. It's all about representations. And then you have this kind of a message passing model inside the head of different modules sending coded messages to each other. And then in the end, there's some kind of an output. And then we're done, right?
Right.
But I think everyone with even a little bit of reflection realizes that natural, that's not at all what it's like. You don't act and then you're done, right? You're continuously acting. It's a continuous exchange with the environment that is not broken up into stimulus response type things. John Dewey said this 130 years ago. Anyway, the point is that I think everybody really knows that that's not enough. It kind of has to be said, kind of has to be made explicit, and then you start asking then you just ask other questions. It's not about, for example, internal representations. It's more about what you accomplish with a particular system. Now, of course, if somebody asking you how memory works, well, it's going to be hard to answer that question from my perspective, because I'm saying, well, it's not one thing. Tell me what kind of memory you're interested in.
Yeah.
If skill memory, then we can talk about it in this context. If it's, autobiographical memory, well, I don't know that much about that. And that is, probably going to be harder to unravel.
But that's I think the beauty of long form podcasts, for one. I think that you can do amazing scientific communication in a long form podcast. And I would love to see more scientists do it, because I mean, in 70 minutes, we obviously haven't touched on every detail of the brain development, but I think we've given very good, sizable takeaways of 300 million years of evolution. And of course, there's so many more details, but I think it really helps to contextualize titles like words, labels like hypothalamus within the context of this story that we've kind of been unraveling slowly. We have an animal, we have a very, very primitive brain, and we say that the hypothalamus allowed it to control its body probably for the first time 800 million years ago. There's so much understanding there that someone can take when they don't have possibly understanding of what any of those subcomponents are, but together as a story, it starts to make sense, and we can introduce a new brain region with a bit more contextualization, a bit more, and we can kind of bring that story together. But without that, it's very difficult. In short form content, you're going to end up pissing some researchers off because you're going to get some mechanism wrong. I've taken word for word what one neuroscientist has said and put it in short form, and another neuroscientist have said, no, that's actually not correct. Dopamine is one of those examples. But that's going to be the
case regardless of how long the form is. I mean, I could go on for 10 hours and it'll still, I'll make even more mistakes. No, but you know what? There's I guess there's a couple of takeaway messages that I think kind of need to be pointed out, and it's again something that the reader or listener already kind of knows, but the implications maybe should be emphasized. One is this point that I make about feedback control. Everybody knows that behavior is not stimulus response, right?
Right.
The point is, what are the repercussions of that? Of course, it's a control system, sure, but what are the repercussions in terms of the kinds of mechanisms that we might seek to find, and even the kinds of questions we might ask? The questions now have to be framed in the context of a control system, as opposed to in the context of a knowledge acquisition system, right? So that's one thing. The other thing I think I would point out, again, more specifically on the point of evolution, is that a lot of people think about evolution and they think about natural selection. They say, well, evolution is nature's way of solving problems posed by the world, and it uses natural selection to try out different solutions, and then it hits upon the ones that work. But of course, and then they talk about, okay, well, my theory is good because it confers a certain selective advantage to the animal. This mechanism is good because it has some value. And it's going to be selected. But what often people don't pay attention to as much is the other part of evolution, which is descent with modification. And that one is actually much more valuable for building theories and evaluating theories, because it's such a powerful constraint on mechanism, right? There can be many, many different mechanisms that are optimal, right? But most of them, in fact, almost all of them, are not compatible with a modification, with this descent with modification.
Explain system. That, just if you could elaborate a little bit on that descent with modification idea.
It's the idea that you are a modification of an ancestor who is a modification of another ancestor. And because every ancestor has to be viable and has to succeed in all of the challenges of life,
right?
There are only certain modifications that even enter into the natural selection game, right? So the point is, you could have lots of mechanisms that will do really well, but most of them are not available as a small modification of an ancestral system. So, for example, we all have a superior colliculus escape circuit that probably dates back to our last common ancestor with Amphioxus, because there was no generation that could go without it.
Right.
In our lifestyle, in our type of, in the lineage, all throughout, all the lifestyles that our ancestors went through, there was never a stage you can do it. You can't introduce a whole new structure. You can't just plop on a neocort. So there's this idea, the triune brain idea, very popular. There's a reptilian brain and a neo-mammalian brain, and then a paleo-mammalian brain and a neo-mammalian brain, as if they're sort of added on top of each other.
Right.
But you can't add things in evolution. You can't just plop a whole new module on, because how, it's going to have a developmental plan. It's going to have input and output connections. How is that whole thing going to just suddenly appear dramatically out of thin air? No, it has to be a modification. It has to be sort of like things enlarge and specialize, things bulge, projection patterns shift. It always has to be gradual. And so again, let's go back to the inverted retina, right? Hawks would see better if they had a proper retina with the receptors facing the right way. But flipping them is not available. It's just not available as part of the developmental program, because too many assumptions have been piled on top of that. Neural tube formation. You cannot, if you don't form the neural tube, you're not going to play the natural selection game. You're not going to be in the running. You're just going to die at birth. And so, regardless of how useful that would be, it doesn't enter. And so there's many theories out there about how the brain might work, and a lot of them just go right out the window. Once you apply that constraint of continuity, a lot of those theories just go out the window. And you don't have to worry. You don't have to think about them anymore, because if it's not compatible with that, then it's just not biologically plausible.
Right.
So that's another big message, because that again says that when you think about how the brain is working, you cannot think simply in terms of adaptation and how good it is that it's doing things this way. Because it has to, again, the theory has to be compatible with this gradual progression. And there's many theories out there that talk about natural selection, but don't respect the constraint of descent with modification. So anyway, that, and then just to connect that to feedback control, it was always feedback control, right? From the very beginning, and it's an expansion of feedback control into more and more sophisticated behavioral systems, and it's never changed, and it can't change because it's not available. The idea of restructuring the system into a mess, let's say, the idea of modularity, like Fodor's type of modularity of the mind. These are a lot of theories about this. You have a module for this, you have a module for that. It's not compatible with evolution, right? All those theories, unless one comes up with a plausible story of how they differentiated over time, they go out the window. The idea that you could suddenly take a feedback control system and subdivide it differently into these little message passing modules, it's very implausible. I mean, there may be variations of it that one could defend, but I think most of them have not confronted this constraint, and so they were developed and elaborated, in science. I think in a way that ultimately is going to fail because it just cannot evolve. If it cannot evolve,
right?
Then So again, the idea of a computer metaphor kind of goes out the window, right?
Do you think that was really well put? Do you think that one of the reasons there's such a replication crisis across psychology and neuroscience is that researchers are kind of trying to shove this stimulus perception mindset paradigm onto human beings when it is a feedback control paradigm where we should be testing?
I don't think that. I don't think that's the reason. I think the replication crisis has more to do with just a general. I don't think it's it's because of a particular theoretical viewpoint. I think
Okay.
it's partially due to difficulty of doing the experiments and getting the right statistics. I think it has to do with things like statistical power that are going to apply to any experimental work, regardless of what theory it's based on. So,
Okay.
I'm just as susceptible to having flawed results because, if I use, if my statistical significance is at p less than 0.05, well, then I'm 1 out of 20 times I'm going to be wrong,
Yeah.
just as much as anybody else. So I think that's mostly just about just a sheer challenge of doing this kind
Gotcha.
of work.
Yeah. What do you, because that was I really like that you mentioned the triune model. I've talked about that in a couple of videos, and I love Lisa Feldman Barrett's work on emotion. I think how emotions are made is one
Oh,
of
yeah.
the.
You had Lisa on the show?
I haven't. I've emailed her. I'll
Oh.
have to email her again. She's very busy and doing a lot of talks, but I'd absolutely love to have her on. What are some other commonly held myths about evolution that you think are very prominent, but people might not know that it's just not true?
Well, the biggest one is the idea that it has a purpose, that it's the nature's way of solving problems. I like to describe it as, evolution doesn't even identify problems to solve, right? It just produces variations, and then it favors those that happen to solve something that used to be a problem, right?
Right.
So they sort of stumble on the solution, and as at that point, I guess you could say it has identified a problem because these animals do better than these other animals. But again, it's, Richard Dawkins had great, has great examples of great ways of thinking about this. The blind watchmaker, and I think that's one of the most important ones. That it's not like, oh, there's an engineering problem. It's like engineers, solve problems by identifying them, defining them, and then looking for solutions, right?
Yeah.
And there's certain solutions that you come up with when you follow that approach. But that is not what evolution is doing, right? It only can modify a functioning ancestor in a way that doesn't screw up the system. And this is why, how there's this trend for early stages of development to look very similar among animals.
Right.
That's in part because development is like a recipe, right? There's a set of stages, A, B, C, that essentially build on each other, right? And you can't really screw up stage A if you've got 12 other stages building on it, right? If you don't have that basic thing, even if it was really good, right? You're going to violate the assumptions of later stages. And
Gotcha.
So in the end, you're going to wind up, like, let's say instead of a bilaterally symmetric body, it'd be better to be trilaterally symmetric. Well, it's just ain't going to happen. There's too many assumptions built on that already, that even if it could pay off really well, it's going to violate everything else, and everything else will fall apart. And in the end, you'll wind up on, stillborn. So,
Gotcha.
there's these kinds of really powerful constraints on how the system could work. So again, the triune brain is not really, you can't add structures. They have to sort of emerge gradually out of existing systems, and they can stumble onto new roles. Right now, that's, of course, could still happen. You can use your lobed fins to walk on land eventually. So they can stumble onto new roles, but they have to have a history.
Right. Do you think the way that you've been talking about looking back at evolution could inform the way we're making AI models today? And some of the flaws and problems that these large language models have is that we're not doing any sort of evolutionary process to them. It is just bulk scaling in one moment of information.
Well, I think the biggest issue there is that they're treating the problem as an input-output mapping, right?
Right.
Large language models and almost all neural networks are essentially doing input-output mappings. And so in a sense, the idea of feedback control already says that's wrong, right? That's not what behavior is like. And so if you can describe behavior as a input to output mapping, but then you're missing half of it, right? You're missing the other half, the output to input, which gives meaning to the whole thing. So anyway, because AI systems and computer models have mostly focused on the input to output part of behavior. For that reason, I think they lack what's called grounding. This idea. I guess I'll explain it
Yeah,
anyway.
please cover it.
So there's this idea that how does a system know the meaning of the representations that it contains?
Mhm.
Something like a computer, like a large language model that's having a conversation. Does it actually know what it's talking about? And the answer is no. It doesn't actually know. It knows It knows the syntax. It knows how to form sentences and paragraphs, but it doesn't have any access to the meaning of the concepts, because the meaning of the concepts has to do with things like interacting with the world. Um, and so, in other words, if you have a control system that is interacting with, let's say it's seeking food, and it has categories that that are useful for deciding whether to approach or avoid something. Those categories have meaning in the system because they are actually they are actually affecting the animal's state in the world. They actually are accomplishing the goal of the system,
Right.
which is to affect the state. And then so that's acting through the world, right? So that's an animal going out there and controlling its internal nutrient state by acting through the world and approaching things. But a creature can also control its nutrient state by acting through the world through other creatures in that world, right? So instead of going and reaching for the apple, I can say, "Hey, could you hand me that apple?" Right? And assuming that there is a benevolent, understanding being that I'm speaking to, I will get that apple, right? Simply not by walking out and grabbing it, but by uttering some sentences, some noise, making some noise out of my mouth that happens to persuade this other person to go and hand me the apple, right? Now, that works because other agents, other humans in my environment are incredibly sophisticated, but relatively predictable, right? In so far as, we establish some relationships with each other. And so because of that, I can control my nutrient state, right? And so now you can say that the utterance that I just made with words like please and give and apple, those things serve a function for me. And I know what that function is because I use them to control my nutrient state. And so and the animals do this too. Animals influence each other and get things through each other, control their state through the others.
Right.
But we take this to a really high level, or a really abstract level, right? Like, for example, we build relationships such that next time I ask you for an apple, you'll give it to me as opposed to throw it at me or take it or whatever, right? And so we build these relationships so that we can then later interact in these useful ways, and I'll give you an apple when you ask for it, and you give, the point is that there's these little utterances, these little noises that I make work because there's a shared understanding of what you will do when you hear them, and I can make, on the basis of that prediction, I can have a meaningful interaction with my environment, right? And it relies on very much on what's in your head. Now, again, and so all those symbols like please and give and apple have meaning to me and to you because there's this shared interaction that they're referring to. But if you do that to a large language model, it's just trained on listening to the interactions that you and I had in which those words appeared in that order and certain things happened, and it's seeing the patterns, it's seeing the input-output patterns, right? But it's not actually learning any causal structure,
Right.
Of interactions that actually have the meaning, right? It's simply mimicking the pattern of noises that are coming between us, right? But the pattern of noises, we could be speaking a different language, we could make up a language, and we'll still have those interactions, right? And so the noises, the syntax, even the syntax isn't really the important thing. And so large language models and many neural networks really are solving a kind of a pattern prediction and pattern completion problem without actually ever being given the meaning, the probable meaning. So
Right.
they've never been given a chance to actually learn meaning. They're just learning the structure of spoken language. And so when I read the text that ChatGPT produces, on the basis of training on meaningful conversations between people, I will be able to interpret the meaning of those words because I know the meaning of those words, right? And so it's like the training set, the humans that produce the training set knew the meaning, and the person who reads the produced text, the transformed text, knows the meaning, but the transformer doesn't know the meaning. Right. It just completes the patterns. So it's this Chinese, this classic Chinese room argument, right? And I think it's essentially that.
Yeah.
I think again. So when I say to AI, sorry, I did warn you that I ramble.
It's brilliant.
So
You're
the
rambling.
thing with AI is, I think they're asking certain problems, certain questions, like how to do input-output mappings, and those are interesting or whatever. But I don't think those are getting at the basis of intelligence, which has to really confront the issue of semantics and meaning.
Right.
And I think I think you should do more, autonomous robotics, reinforcement learning models, things that actually are constructed to learn interactions as opposed to input-output.
Right. I was talking to Dr. Tony Zador on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
He was brilliant. We had a great conversation, but he brought up this idea that I'm sure you're familiar with about having AI agents in digital environments, and they could go through these environments and they interact with challenges, and then they would evolve in, a way that you could possibly analogize with how organisms interacted with their environment and evolved to overcome those challenges. My question was I'm sure you're familiar with those sort of paradigms and how a model could be created from that. And I think that's a really cool and powerful idea. But I'm curious about how would you design those environments? How would you choose what challenges to put the agent through? How would you know what to throw at them so that agent might, evolve in the way that you might want? Or is there any way that you'd be able to predict how that agent would evolve in different scenarios?
Well, I think, that's a cool question. I mean, I think it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. If you're trying to make an artificial system that's just good at something, then I think there's many different ways to make that environment. And I'm not exactly sure what I would suggest. I mean, obviously you want to start it with something relatively simple,
right,
and then gradually make it more complex, rather than just give it an incredibly complex problem there's no chance in solving. So, I mean, there's a lot of these kinds of studies that have been done. I don't know if there was classic work from Carl Sims where he essentially reinforced these sort of virtual agents to travel, either jump high or travel across a horizontal surface quickly using sort of realistic physics. And they would evolve all kinds of crazy strategies for moving their bodies. Some looked biological and some were just completely crazy. So, I mean, I think if you want to accomplish a goal, then I think it's fairly open-ended as to how to do it. But also it's kind of hard to know how to do it, right? Because you don't know where to start. I would say definitely, though, start with something simple and add to it. Right? Rodney Brooks suggested, this kind of idea of building behaviors on behaviors. So first get it moving, and then get it steering, and then have it, sort of control that steering in some sensible way. If you wanted to build a model of an actual biological brain, then you have more, I think, guidance as to what stages to take it through, and then do something like, or let's think about a mobile predator that has to orient itself and catch things, and then it would be like Brayton Burke's vehicles, or some kind of a sort of steering system and you could base it on biology. You could base it on studies of fish and lamprey and zebrafish, for example, a very well studied. And then you could think about, all right, let's get this thing now. It has to get out on land, has to locomote on land. How is it going to do that? And so Auke Eichspiert, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name, has been doing this kind of thing where he sort of has these sort of robot salamanders. I mean, actual physical robots, but also simulated.
Wow, that's so cool.
Robot salamanders can swim and walk and do it in a sort of biologically plausible way. And his engineering type solutions are actually pretty good models of the spinal cord.
Wow.
And so you could do that, and then you could keep going with that. You could go for something that, let's say, then guides itself with optic flow, like fish do, surely, but also certainly out on land, animals do, and have sort of autonomous robots that take advantage of certain properties of the world, like optic flow, for example, which can be a very robust strategy for controlling yourself while running through the world. So, that might be, so on one hand, it'd be really good to do it. It'd be good for understanding the brain to build artificial systems in this way that actually mimics what happened in our lineage. But it might actually even be a good way to get just if your ultimate goal is having artificial intelligence and not necessarily a model of the brain, it might still be a good way because it did work, right? In us. It did create these creatures that are capable of
Took a
these
while.
things. Yeah, it took a while. And it probably would take a while going that way. And I'm sure some of the steps are completely unnecessary.
Right.
Like becoming nocturnal and becoming diurnal again. Yeah, okay, that's shifted sort of the brain structures. And, it had a fortuitous consequence, is that because we relied on the neocortex instead of the midbrain, it so turns out the neocortex is, well, according to some theories, is easier to enlarge than the midbrain because of its structure. And therefore, by relying on it, opened us up for later becoming really sophisticated because we've got this thing that we can really enlarge. And it's really for very mundane reasons why it enlarges more easily than other things. It has to do with wiring efficiency and things like that. Anyway, the point is, so maybe there's some things that were useful, but I doubt it. I doubt you'll actually have to go through all those convoluted things if your goal is to make an intelligence.
Right.
But I still think one thing you absolutely need is you need to have semantics. You have to have that kind of closed loop interaction, and be working on expanding it, essentially taking a simple feedback system and let it learn how to expand its control into more abstract domains. Like there's the point of I see an apple, I grab it. Then there's the idea of I see an apple and I ask someone to give it to me. And then there's the really abstract thing where, I put money in the bank so that later I can go and take it out and buy that apple. There's levels of abstractions that we have reached, but they're all, again, the context is always some kind of a behavioral state control.
Do you think so the goal that they talk about, the goal that Sam Altman talks about and people in the industry say is AGI, so a generalizable artificial intelligence. Do you think that to build something like that, motion is intrinsic, like having some physical body that you are actually moving and navigating within a world? Is that fundamental to AGI, which is, I don't know, we can arbitrarily define that now because it's defined by lots of different ways. But do you think motion is intrinsic to that for some reason? By the fact that the computer is obviously just servers somewhere in a building. Does it need to be attached to a robot that's moving to get to the next level of intelligence thing?
Yeah, so I think there's many ways you could define intelligence, but if you just think about like human-like AGI, then I don't think it has to be physical. I don't think you have to have it in a physical body that's actually interacting with the real world. But I do think interaction is necessary. So whatever virtual world it's interacting has to, again, if you want it to be human-like, it has to sort of have some of the same contingencies in it.
Right.
Like, for example, two objects cannot occupy the same place at the same time. That's a really reliable fact of life. And that's something that brains can use to simplify the problem of, guidance and such. Certain aspects of geometry, something in front of you that's out of range will be in range if you move forward. Very simple, kind of like obvious facts of life in a physical world. I think if those are there, then you build artificial systems that deal with that, then again, semantics is necessary, right? You have to have that closed loop, and you have to give the system some way of expanding that loop, whether by your evolving it, sort of, through kind of like an intelligent design type thing, or letting it stumble onto solutions. But anyway, the point is you have to give it the ability to expand its domain of interaction towards new levels of abstractions. That's what happened in humans. I mean, the remarkable thing about human brains is that they adapted to a kind of a complex, large primate living in social groups, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And yet now we're using that same brain for very different types of activity. Our lives are really different. I mean, one could say that the most important parts of our life are still the same. It's still sort of the social group and the interactions that we have with specific individuals. But we're also capable of doing all kinds of really bizarrely abstract things that those humans never did. And so if we could build a artificial primate that solves the kinds of problems that primates deal with, including the social interaction problems, I think we'd be a long way to real human-like AGI. Rather than go right into language and complex knowledge or something, I would say that we go a little bit from the past to the present, and build a structure, build an architecture that's capable of dealing with the kinds of with the niche that primates live in, and then I think we're almost there. I mean, maybe that's silly, maybe that's just underestimating the massiveness of the problem. But I do think we'll be a lot of the way there.
Right.
And again, it's human-like intelligence, right? So there's certain things that, for example, the serial order of our thinking and our behavior, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're dealing with a geometric world. You can't do multiple things at the same time. Again, two objects can't occupy the same place. And some of it is kind of arbitrary, like the fact that we have forward-facing eyes and we rely so much on vision creates a kind of a serial order to a lot of our strategy of dealing with the world, because we look at one thing or we look at another thing, and then we act on the thing we look at, and our gaze controls us, determines so much of what we do. And a lot of our strategies, I think, for dealing with the world use that kind of system. We look at things, we appraise, we decide, no, that's not what I want to go for. I'm going to look for something else. That actually shapes sort of the structure, the sort of sequential temporal structure of our intelligence.
Right.
Whereas a artificial system just said, go be intelligent, doesn't have any of those constraints. It could do anything. But again, if we want it human-like, it kind of has to have similar semantics. And I think those semantics are going to be very much embedded in a geometric world of some sort. Again, I don't think it has to be physical, because there's, once you start building a robot, then you're you're spending all your time like fixing little broken wires and greasing gears, or I don't know what. I mean, you're not doing the theoretical stuff. Whereas if you're doing it inside a simulation, you can sort of do away with the wear and tear and all the other things. But I think it has to be a pretty good simulation, right?
Right.
You have to do something like like an Unreal Engine with good physics, and really let it have to deal with the actual output input contingency, that if it moves, what's the optic flow that results, or what are the forces that result, things like that.
Well, I saw only 2 days ago or something that Google DeepMind just came out with their infinite world generator. I don't know if you saw this. It's just a model that's capable of creating infinite virtual worlds, and you can...
Well, I mean, so, I mean, you can, but I wouldn't say jump right away and throw it into a really complex world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can give it world. You can sort of, babies don't make it out on their own right away, right?
Yeah.
Give them a little bit. And in fact, actually, I think that this kind of curriculum learning idea that you sort of train them in a way that makes later learning easier. I mean, that's what we do. You know, you don't just say to the baby, you don't just give a baby the entire internet. Here, learn how to talk.
Yeah.
You know, like ChatGPT. No, you first teach interactions. You make them notice that when they make a noise, you know, the parent comes and gives them that apple. You know, so the point is, I think we need to gradually train it towards more complexity, and I think we want to maybe start with a relatively realistic world, but maybe one in which there's a parent, essentially a benevolent, complex creature that's easy to control, so that you don't actually you actually learn how to control your parents before you learn how to control your arms and legs, right, because they're so easy to control,
right.
The parents, I mean, you know. Do you have kids?
I don't, not yet, no.
Okay, well, if you do someday, look out, because you'll see how easily controllable you are.
I'm sure I'll be manipulated to do all sorts of things against my will.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be.
It is manipulation. Anyway, so the point is, I think to make it easier on the AI, we might want to sort of take a lesson from that. You know,
Makes sense.
you learn how to control your world in a sort of safe environment without major damage, and then you gradually make your way out, or you start crawling and walking and jumping, and you know, speaking is the same thing. You first learn just how to get somebody's attention, then you learn how to steer them slightly into giving you food versus water, let's say, and so on, and you build those interactions with them, and they actually help you. They actually have to make it simple. So it's almost like Robo Baby. You know, Baby AI is a project that Yoshua Benjo is doing here. I don't know what stage it's on, but basic idea that you want to kind of train them,
right?
Kind of like a baby, right?
It's so fascinating. It's so interesting, and who knows where it will be a couple of decades from now? You know, a radically different place than it is today. Are you overall?
Yeah, well, you know, I am a little bit
pessimistic.
I am a little bit. Sorry,
nihilistic, pessimistic.
Not pessimistic, but a little bit sort of disappointed, maybe, about how people have focused on the input-output mapping issue to almost the exclusion of everything else. Because I understand the value of having,
made a good commercial product, right? I guess they were really.
Well, I mean, the value of having a machine vision system that's as good as some of the systems that exist, or a translation system that's as good as or ChatGPT, which with its even with its flaws, it's pretty impressive, right?
Yeah,
the value of these things is so high that it's taken over the field. But I think there were other things that were being done,
right,
that I think were better long-term, for long-term progress, like realistic reinforcement learning, as opposed to gigantic data set reinforcement learning. Those kinds of ideas, I think, were leading to good directions. I think they're being abandoned because everybody's just jumping on the bandwagon of where
the gold rush. Yeah.
But in the end, I don't think it can work. In the end, that thing is going to produce all kinds of very useful things, but it's not going to produce AGI because it's missing the semantics.
Right.
And so I'm frustrated by that, because, maybe it'll be, 25, 30 years before people come back to those, what I think more promising viewpoints, but I'm going to be like 80 at that point,
It's difficult, right? Because these companies have to fund their research somehow, and when OpenAI are just making free, they just released a $200 per month subscription. When these companies are printing money, the VCs, venture capitalists, how these startups work is just that's where the money is going to fund, large scaling.
Well, but my understanding is Wall Street is starting to get a little bit fed up with AI.
Yeah, maybe.
That because the hype has been so high.
Yeah.
That it can't possibly live up to it, right?
And development, I think, in the last sort of 12 months has probably stagnated a lot more than people thought. Once ChatGPT was released, and then Claude and Mistral and those models were coming out, I think people kind of expected that linear or exponential increases just keep going, but it plateaued earlier than people think or people thought it would. What is your overall, even stepping outside of neuroscience for one final question, are you overall pessimistic, optimistic, nihilistic? Like, what do you think the end result of AI a couple of decades down the line will be in the overall economy?
Well, I don't know. I don't know,
Yeah.
of course. I don't think the current approach is going to produce AGI. So, and that's in some ways good,
So you're
right?
not as
So we're not going
scared.
to have the Terminator scenario.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think we're really in danger of that because it's not trying to achieve its own purposes.
Yeah.
So maybe it's good,
Yeah. Yeah.
actually, for society.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be another AI winter. I mean, AI has, as Jan LeCun said, died like many times already because of all the hype. Right now, I think there probably will be a big bubble bursting, but I don't think it's going to burst to nothing. I think there's still, I mean, the things are useful. The things are undeniably useful, and they will remain useful, and more useful things are going to come up with. There's going to be plenty of innovation. I think I wouldn't necessarily, as a young person, devote myself into that field because, as a high school student, because by the time you graduate, the hype may have died off and it might be actually hard to find a job. It's a little bit like being a computer scientist. There was a time it was just incredibly, it paid off, right?
Right.
Whereas, later, no, then like everybody else, you're struggling for a job. But so anyway, so I don't think it's going to really burst like AI winters in the past. But I do think there's going to be a kind of a unfulfilled promises. There's going to be a lot of people saying, "Where's my robot butler?"
Right.
Even self-driving cars. I don't know. I don't know
Really?
if we're going to be, because robustness is so important there.
Right.
And I think different approaches might be needed, but I think probably there will be. I think just with the machine vision and all that we know about control systems, I think probably maybe. I'm not getting into one anytime soon, but not the robot butler. That's
Damn it.
Don't hold your breath for that one.
Damn it.
Or many other AGI type dreams that people have. So I think there's going to be a bit of a shift. And again, I think, and many people think, that you need to have a more control theory oriented approach, more about, sort of embodiment and sort of situated robotics. And, people have been saying this for decades. Brooks most famously, but other people have said this.
Yeah.
And I think there probably will come into that kind of to try to capture the semantics. And but then I don't know. I mean, maybe it won't be so good, right? Because maybe then they'll be uncooperative or
right. Would you?
I mean, I don't think so. I actually think we can. I think we can.
We keep the reins on and keep the leashes shackled.
Yes, and this is something that that we think about a lot around here. Is what do we really need? I mean, do we need them to, for example, serve their own goals, or could they actually be controlling the state such that the human is the one who benefits? I mean, there's no necessity for an intelligent control system necessarily, I think, to be selfish. Right. It just has to have an understanding of the semantics of interaction within which it works. The one problem, of course, is if we want it to be able to understand, if we want it to be human-like, where we can sort of have a conversation with it, then I don't know what we need to include or don't need to include.
Right.
Time will tell, right?
If all the money that was going into GPU clusters and scaling current sort of models like the GPT-01, whatever the new models are, if you took all of that money and you put it into however you would train these models in complex virtual environments, literally all of that money, and there was no promise of, you didn't need to make a commercial product, all you were trying to do was make human-like models. Would you be scared of the potentiality of those AI models? I mean, obviously you're guessing because you don't know the results of those tests, but assume you could redirect all of that funding away from scaling commercial products into just research of, like, how do we create AGI human-like models? Is that a future we should be nihilistic about?
Well, I mean, I think whether or not we do that, one of the biggest threats is always the bad actor
Right.
scenario, right? I mean, there's any
Foreign, yeah.
technology can be abused, and more powerful technologies can be abused terribly. So that's always a danger, regardless of what it is. I think the danger of it getting out of control is higher in the case where you actually have a control system, right? Where it's just an input-output mapping, then it on its own is not really going to get out of control.
Yeah.
I think it could be used in horrible ways by oppressive governments or whatever, or companies. But I think once you train it to be a control system, then it's a question of what defines the desirable state. If it's a just and fair society, a functioning society, well, that would be good. But it's not going to be easy to set up that kind of set of criteria. I mean, I think I think it's going to have to be done very careful. And I think that even though I feel that there's a lot of sort of scare things being said about, oh my God, the AI is so powerful. A lot of that I think is just clever marketing. It's like, my God, my system is so powerful. The government better put some reins on it, and then of course right away the investors come.
Yes. Yes.
So I think a lot of that is just marketing. But on the other hand, the fact that attention is being paid to these issues, I think it's never too early to start, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's never too early to start thinking about it just in case. And I think it's good that people are thinking about human-aligned AI, even if I don't think the danger is imminent.
Right.
At some point it might be imminent, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think it's all well-spent effort. As far as all the money that's put into scaling, no, I think if it was put into different kinds of systems, I think it would have a different outcome. But I have no idea what that would be, right? I mean, I have some ideas about what's missing, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be like a silver bullet, right? It's not. Right. It's not necessarily. There's not 100 other things missing. So,
right.
Paul, but I don't think the if it doesn't work, make it bigger is really good strategy. I don't think that ultimately is going to make it.
That seems to be the dominant opinion of most of the neuroscientists that I've talked to on the podcast, is that they just don't think scaling gets you there, because they know, or they understand that human element a lot more than computer scientists might. I think I'm sure Tony Zador had many of the same kinds of things that I would say, and many others. Because you're right, I think neuroscientists look at this and saying, "Oh my God," but it's not even doing anything like like what I mean. Not to say that it's not a different kind of intelligence. Yeah,
right?
It's clearly not human intelligence.
As Alison Gopnik said, in some ways, a library is intelligent, right? A library contains enormous amounts of knowledge.
Right.
You could call that intelligence. It's not human-like, but in some ways it is. And so, with a good indexing system, like a human who goes into the library, the whole thing now becomes much more intelligent than that human was on their own.
Right.
So in some ways, you could say that about AI systems, right?
True.
And, you just have to accept that it's not human-like. Yeah, and if you want human-like, then I think it's missing several key pieces.
Right. Paul, this has been an amazing conversation. It's been so much fun. We've learned so much about evolution just past 2 hours. It's barely felt like it. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. I think we had a masterclass in the evolution of the brain, gone through some very, very big points, touched on AI at the end. It's been such a thrill to talk to you, and thank you so much for giving up your time.
Thanks. I really, again, appreciate the invitation.